Thank you all for being here and being a part of the Tennessee Local Food Summit. And we say we are gathering here to be about the business of transformation, to be about the business of a revolution, a paradigm shift in our food and agricultural system. Now, as we see here, the theme is weaving webs of connection. I'm going to share a few thoughts about what that means to me in a bit. Now, I also chose a sub-theme, ancestral vibrations guide our connections to the land. So before I proceed with my talk, I see in the room a few empty chairs, empty tables, which tells me that everybody isn't here yet. And taking the theme of ancestral vibrations, and what I do oftentimes, I bring with me a number of things. This is a talking stick. It's a Tibetan bowl. Ancestral vibrations. I'm using that to allow us, before I proceed, to call our ancestors. So I've asked each of us to think about your ancestors. Those who came before you, that's the reason why you're sitting here. Think about those parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and other ancestors. Think about their names, the memories, and invite them to sit next to you. Invite them to come tonight to be a part of this conversation. Because you know, we as humans are in a pickle. We got rivers, Mississippi, Colorado drying up. Got floods, hurricanes, fires, increased inequities, increased violence, all kinds of pandemics overlapping. We're in a pickle. And don't think the solutions only lie with us who are sitting here. So, let's take a moment and do our calling of the ancestors. Thank you. Now. Oh, I can see a few now. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Absolutely. Thank you. Now, and I wasn't just talking about the human ancestors, because we shouldn't think as well in this homocentric view of the world that we have the solutions as just the human species. We want to call upon all of the ancestors. And I will be trying to help illuminate that, calling all of our ancestors. This is a chart that shows the age of the earth. She's been around about 4.5 billion years. And sometimes, you hear folks say, who are involved as an environmental activist, oh, we're going to We're trying to save the planet. No, she's going to be fine. We're trying to save our own butts. But think about ancestors. Look at this chart here and find where there is soil and dirt. You know, we're here for a food and ag summit, which generally means what is growing in the soil. I have been accused, I've been told sometimes as Jim Embry, man, you so old, you as old as dirt. I said, well, yeah, I've been around since the dinosaurs, and my brain's fossilized, yes. But dirt is an ancestor. And she says it's 500 million years old. And we have been doing all manner of things to fill her full of chemicals, to devastate her, to ignore her. Because we've been taught by this Newtonian view of the world that the earth is a machine. She's inanimate. The rocks, the floor and the fauna, the water aren't really living things. They're inanimate. So the soil, the dirt, is an ancestor. And we should regard her as such. Now, some 100, 200 million years ago, because we had dirt, flowering trees and plants came along with seeds. They're our ancestors. So in the future, as we're asked to call the ancestors, don't forget the soil, the dirt, the trees, the flora and the fauna. And then about 2 million years ago, humans came along. Because there were flowering trees and plants with seeds, because there was dirt, because there was water. That kind of thinking is what we should be thinking about coming out of this summit. Now they said, Jim, you've got 3 hours to talk. But she said, talk about vision. Talk about systems thinking, and talk about food and justice. So part of our vision for the future needs to be predicated on this sense of the history of the earth, where we have come from, to better know where we're going. Because of dirt, because of all the flowering of beautiful trees and plants and seeds and whatever, we have this spectacular, fantastical diversity on the earth that's described by some faith folks as the Garden of Eden. That means the earth. Now, we've come along as humans with a real huge footprint. As a previous chart showed, we've been around about 1.8 million years, and we're probably the newest species on the earth. And we're still maturing as a species. So part of our work that we're involved in all of our various capacities, is to help us mature as a species. You say, well, Jim, I'm just trying to raise some collard greens. I'm just trying to raise some chickens, and oh, absolutely true. With this idea of vision, this idea of systems thinking, is also applied that we're trying to contribute to the maturation of us as a species, because we're impacting the whole world. We have a huge footprint. And how do we then regain or gain the stewardship, the responsibility to be earth caretakers? Maturation. To protect, preserve, honor, love this tremendous diversity that this chart represents. And a friend of mine, Rowan White, a seed keeper, paraphrased it this way: it's not just land, soil that is broken, but more importantly, our relationship to land. We can't meaningfully proceed with healing, with restoration, with regeneration without changing the story. Trees don't have a problem understanding their connection with the soil, because their roots are embedded in the soil, and they traverse miles and across continents. They're clear on who they are. They're clear about this connection with soil and all that is in the soil. It's us as humans who have to then remember or rethink those connections. Here are some images that provide the sense of how do we become rooted as a species? How do we begin to regard the earth, the soil, the water as a sacred relationship? Most spiritual texts talk about things like, and God reached down and picked up clay soil and breathed the breath of life into humans. So soul is like the sacred medium that becomes us. So how do we take these images and begin to bring them into our own lives? So again, I was asked by the planning team, Natalie and so forth, to talk about systems thinking, vision, food injustice. For the last 500 years, we've been guided by this mechanistic view of the world. We call it the Newtonian, Cartesian view of the world. Isaac Newton, Rene Descartes, and those folk. But said again, to understand the world is to do it in its separation and how it's disconnected. And that the earth and the rocks and the water and the land aren't living. That the earth isn't a living organism, it's inanimate. So we must impact, change how we're thinking, how we view the world, from one that is homocentric to one that is earth-centric, from one that is a Newtonian view of the world to one that is based upon the principles of quantum thinking, spiritual teachings, into one that is based upon what's called systems thinking. When it applies to food and ag, we're talking about thinking about how the whole system works. And sometimes people say, well, Jim, I can't, it's too hard to think like that. With all these different systems going on, my head hurts. I can't fathom it all. I try to remind us that our human bodies are composed of about 74 organs. But don't believe me, go to Wikipedia or Google and search up human body organs, about 74. And they all work as a system. They don't compete. They don't argue back and forth. They cooperate. They get along fine. So that innate wisdom is already there in us for systems thinking. But we're not taught in K through 12, we're not taught in college to tap into that innate wisdom that's already there. So, I think there's a workshop tomorrow on systems thinking. But I encourage us to think about that innate wisdom. Now, I hope you all have your pens and pencils out and taking notes. This video will be recorded. You can follow from there. And please feel free anytime to email me, call me, text me, whatever you need to do to carry on our conversation together. Please do that. But I'm going to refer tonight to a number of references. And one of them, if you want a really good book about systems thinking, moving away from this Newtonian view of the world, I recommend these two books here as guiding posts to this idea of developing a vision for the future. The web of life then corresponds with the theme, weaving webs of connections. Vision for the future. The Food Summit, all the great work being done was done by Jeff Poppin for so many years. All the various work going on at the various universities and faith groups and farms and whatever ought to be woven together in a sense of vision for the future. Out of the summit, out of a conference, ought to come a tangible document. Yes, it's great to have a physical conceptual framework, but a tangible document that says, here is our vision for 2050. Then when we come to 2023 Food Summit, what we do, the workshops, the speakers correspond to that first 5 years of a 30-year vision. Then it begins to make sense when we gather, and how do we then choose workshops and speakers? Now, I have spent the last 12 years or so studying intensely George Washington Carver. I've known of him my whole life because my parents believed in giving us this sense of heritage, cultural heritage, was part of how I grew up. And I heard Carver's name when I was young. He says, where there is no vision, there is no hope. We should have this quote somewhere on our refrigerator. Now, this is a picture of how Carver grew up. I hope you'll all take time to study him, read about him. In my view, if we're talking about a vision for the future, and don't include Carver in the conversation, don't include Carver in the conceptualization, in the teaching, in my view, then we can't be serious about a vision for the future. Here's how he grew up. He was born enslaved. Father died before he was born. His mother got kidnapped and taken away. He was reared by the folks who had enslaved them. Because he was sickly, he spent his first 4, 5, 6 years out in the garden, out in the forest, out with nature. And they were his teachers. The trees, the dragonflies, the butterflies, the plants, the animals were his teachers. Wow. And what did he become? He became according to Einstein and Edison, they called him the greatest scientist of their era. What if all of our kids grew up like this? So the vision of the future has to be how in our work, in our organizations, in our schools, in our faith institutions, and whatever else, how do we ensure that our kids are growing up with what Carver called nature study? He wrote at Tuskegee 44 bulletins over 43 years, and the first one was about nature study in schools in 1898. The future is based upon how well we ensure that our children have a close connection we call nature, the environment, the garden, the farm. Vision once again. This is a book. I hope you all, if you haven't read it, get a hold of it. And if you want to borrow mine, let me know. It's called The Green Vision of Henry Ford and George Washington Carver. The things that we're doing now about recycling, biofuels, non-dairy products, making all kinds of things from what farmers are growing in the industrial sector. They were discussing this in the 1920s and 30s. Henry Ford's idea was pretty much make the entire automobile, say it again, the entire automobile from products grown by USA farmers. Different things happened. He died in the 30s. His son decided to partner with the big oil companies and make everything from oil, as opposed to making things from farm products. So again, we're talking about vision for the Tennessee Food Summit, and all of our folks who are here, this ought to be part of your resource guide, is this book. Let me mention by saying that if we had listened to indigenous people 400 years ago, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. If we had listened. I say we in parentheses. And if we had listened to these folk in the 30s and 40s, we wouldn't be in a worse shape. So in my view of the future, you see this picture here of the greenery, the trees, the forest, the plants, the animals, the flora and the fauna, flowing towards the future, and the ground in front of them is parched. It's like the Dust Bowl. It's like the soil of the South that was like worsened by cotton growing and many other lands around the world now. But this image isn't just about Carver. He represents all of us. We should see ourselves somewhere in this tapestry. He just represents a mindset, a way of thinking about the future. So please see yourself, see your ancestors, see your children. Okay, food injustice. What does that mean? It means that within food is where injustice began. Within food and ag is where injustice began. Because America, USA, is a land that was stolen by force, by genocide, towards indigenous people who were dispossessed, even here in Tennessee, but also a land based upon the extraction, the enslavement, and built by people who were stolen from their land. That is our nation's fundamental contradiction that we're still trying to reckon with. But the question of land, food and ag represents, again, the fundamental contradiction, but it also represents this tremendous, transformative, revolutionary, radical shift to dislodge all the various forms of injustice. Because our American Revolution wasn't really about freedom, rights, and liberty, as we're taught. It was about the continuation of the manifest destiny of taking land from indigenous people, and it was also about the continued enslavement of African people. If it was about liberty and rights and justice, then white men that didn't own property could have voted. If it was about liberty and justice, white women would have been given the right to vote. If it was about freedom and rights, Africans who were enslaved would have been freed. But it wasn't about that. We talked earlier about changing the story, changing the narrative. I use this imagery of the Sankofa bird that represents this idea that to have a vision for the future, we need to look back from whence we've come to know where we're going. That's our work about the vision for the future. Now, I will be laying out here various conversations about this idea of food, justice, vision, systems thinking, but using these other themes to help us do that. Decolonize. We've all been colonized. We have all been colonized. It's like an onion. You're trying to peel off the layers of colonization. That's critical. We're going to have a workshop just on that. Indigenize. We had opened up this sense of homage to those who've lived here for thousands of years, paying homage to those cultures that lived here in Turtle Island, part of Tennessee. So we all need to become familiar with, embrace, understand, be supportive of indigenous people. But it also means the concept that we're all indigenous to the earth. And how do we claim that kinship? How do we claim that love? How do we claim that sense of connection? What we all have to do. And we have to, this is a new word, feminize. And I'll be showing examples of this. Feminize. It means we all have to have a more nurturing spirit, walking softer on the earth. And when I last checked, I thought, I could be wrong now, I could be wrong. But I thought we all came through women. I think it's right. The word woman has woman and man. Female has female and male. So we should all become feminist. Earth eyes, meaning, it's a new word I've coined, I think, meaning moving away from this homocentric view of the world to one that is earth-centric, doing all kinds of ways. So we can become Imagineers, solutionaries. Now, the theme that I chose for my talk, Ancestral Vibrations Guide Our Connection to the Land, is actually the title of an essay that I wrote in this book right here. And I have on the front table that essay. Got a few copies. Pick some up. I'll have some more tomorrow. But that essay describes my family, my legacy, and how I can be here tonight based upon those who come before me. But this image here on the front cover, in my view, ought to be the iconic image for this century. This is a picture of Leah and Naima Penniman, and they're known for Soulfire Farm up in New York State. And this image of these two women here ought to be the iconic image for this century. But it's not just about two black women, and these sisters here they've got African, they've got indigenous, they've got European, they got all kinds of lineage within their family. But it's also about that we all need to find ways to connect to the land. Not just about women, but men, children. All of us in this century have to find ways on a daily basis to connect with the land in a whole variety of ways. So I hope that you will take this concept as we leave here and say, well, Jim said this was the image for this century. Much like, as you recall, during World War II, when women went into the workforce, they called her Rosie the Riveter, who was in the factories working because the men were in Europe fighting. Very similar kind of projection. This is Leah's book, Farming While Black, which in my view, and I have here on the table a bunch of books. I'm always ordering new books. I love different authors that I know and respect and whatever, all kinds of books. But the one here, in my view, is probably the best of all, because it brings in this wisdom of all kinds of people around the world. It brings in practical tips. It brings in rituals. So, if you don't have a copy of it, find a way, library, order it, Farming While Black. Again, this book is this guidepost of the vision for the future. Now, real quickly, about who I am. This arrow here points out to where I live in Madison County. This is an area at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It's in the Kentucky River watershed. The soil is nourished with limestone rock. It's in land that was inhabited by the Cherokee, the Shawnee, and it was land that we claim stewardship over since 1800. That's when my folk were brought across the mountains in an enslaved condition to Madison County. We came there, we learned the land, learned the flora and the fauna, learned to love the land, and our grandmamas had babies in the field in the land. So we claim, again, stewardship. This land was purchased from those who stole the land in 1890. We've been there ever since. This is my little house. Please come and visit. Got about 30 acres there. I'm a beekeeper, and by the way, here's my first honey extraction here. And I tell you, I got about 100,000 babies, okay? And them mamas be working all summer, okay? Bless their heart. They're home asleep now. But come visit. We do tours here a lot. I've had friends come up from New Zealand who are Maori, folks from Uganda, folks from China, folks from LA. Again, I welcome all of you all to come and visit on our farm here. These are my ancestors here. These great-great-grandparents were enslaved. Their dad fought in the Civil War, died in the Civil War. Their mother, single mom with 8 kids, this is just 3 of the kids, not only survived, but she thrived. Eventually, all the kids wound up purchasing farms, all near each other. And these folks represent why I'm here today. I call our family agrarian intellectual activist. Cousin, Grandmama Harriet was the midwife and herbal healer. Her brother went to what's called Berea College in 1879. Became a school teacher, small farmer, area butcher, blacksmith. Nanny, their sister, was the seamstress, quilt maker, dressmaker, and badass cook. Now, these grandparents were also friends with George Washington Carver, who had come to Kentucky, we know at least 2 times, what was called the colored Chautauqua. They even kind of look alike. But my essay in the book talks about this family lineage with Carver, Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell. That's my family legacy. Now, in 1919, 1,500 black folk came to my city of Richmond for the colored Chautauqua because it featured again Du Bois, Carver, Ida B. Wells. But here is a lesson for the Food Summit. Before they came to the Chautauqua, they sent word out, those who wanted to attend. And they said, well, here is our reading list before you come. Read Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, Souls of Black Folk. Read Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery. Read Ida B. Wells' book about lynching. Read Langston Hughes. That's what they said in 1919. I'm oftentimes befuddled why we have conferences and there's no advanced reading. We ought to have advanced reading resources available. Every workshop ought to have corresponding links, articles, before you arrive to help guide you, to help us develop a common language, a common historical understanding, a common sense of future. That's what they were doing in 1919. My essay goes into more detail. This is amazing because in 1919 it was called Red Summer. That's when some 40 African-American communities across the country were burned down. People were killed, hung, lynched. It's called Red Summer. But these folk were able to have this Chautauqua with 1,500 black folk and not be shot. There are lessons to be learned from that kind of wisdom of our ancestors. Now, in 1972, I think Jeff Poppin was part of that movement of food co-ops. I was a founding member of Good Foods Co-op in 1972. We formed upon 3 principles. One was local food. Second was healthy food. And third was organic food. That was 50 years ago. And we're still alive, still doing quite well. We do about, maybe $12 million a year in terms of business. We purchase items from about 300 different local producers, 50 years. So part of our vision, I was asked again, to provide some guideposts for vision. The vision ought to include cooperatives, food cooperatives, farmer cooperatives, credit unions. Cooperatives is only how humans are mimicking how the earth operates. When a seed goes into the ground, in the soil, there's cooperation between all the soil microbes, the moisture, the air, the sun, the moon. They're all cooperating. So we're trying to learn the natural systems. Back in the year 2000, I moved to Detroit, as was mentioned, to become the director of the Boggs Center. And our work stemmed around youth activism. And we used urban agriculture, art, indie media, and things like that to provide a space for activism to flourish. About every week, I would spend time at this school. It's called the Catherine Ferguson Academy, a school for teen mothers and their children. It was a high school that had a farm. They had horses, they had cows, goats, chickens, bees, 100 fruit trees. They built their own barn, did the plumbing, did the wiring. And I gave tours to that school, the likes of Danny Glover, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, the British Parliament, and the Nobel Peace Committee. They came over to do a look-see at this school. There was a documentary film that was done by some friends in Holland. It's called Grown in Detroit. I hope you all, again, who are taking notes, if you're like me, you can't remember stuff that gets said. Grown in Detroit is available online. Look at that video about the school in Detroit. There ought to be a model for the entire country. This school had a 90% rate of graduation, 80% no second pregnancy. It ought to be a model for the entire country. The kids went to school there from about a month old to 4 years old. Now, at this school, I learned a few things that I'll still talk about. Now, let me ask you all a question. What is the very best first local food? Breast milk. Exactly. But when I go to food and ag conferences, and I do 20 or 30 a year, I hardly ever hear in any of the workshops, any of the promotional stuff, anything about breastfeeding. We ought to, again, we have to change the story, change the narrative. In Kentucky, if you came to a thoroughbred horse farm and said, oh, we're going to give you the best milk for these $1 million racehorses. We want to feed them Infamil, Similac, or even cow's milk. They would run you off the farm. So I'm saying this vision for the future. Let's embrace, let's love, let's understand how important breastfeeding is as part of our sensibility about transforming the food and ag system. This is a turtle that we built, several of these in Detroit, over the years I was there. We built them as a way to remind us about Turtle Island, which is a name given by indigenous people to North America, Turtle Island. That's why we built those, to help the kids understand where we were. One year, a Hopi elder came to Detroit. His grandson lived there. His grandson brought him over to the school for teen moms. Near there was this turtle in our art garden. The elder came there after I gave him a tour of the river with signs saying, mercury poison, don't eat the fish. I gave him a tour of the incinerator, putting out in the smoke, in the air, all the smoke. took him around to all the soil that was contaminated with heavy metals. Then he came here. He knelt down like Colin Kaepernick. He knelt down and he cried and he prayed. He said, I wish you folk who've come here, however you came here, whether you came in chains on a plane, could learn to love Turtle Island like we do. So part of our vision of the future is how do we begin to shed tears for the water and the air and the soil. North America. Take time, I won't tell the whole story here, take time to understand the different indigenous cosmology stories about Turtle Island and how it got formed. When I came back from Detroit and working with the School for Teen Moms, I came back with this commitment to work with other women's groups based upon my Detroit experience. I worked with what was called the Bluegrass Domestic Violence Program, putting in a few raised beds. They've changed their name. Now it's called Greenhouse 17, serving 17 counties. This is an image of Greenhouse 17. This is a program, again, for women who've experienced domestic violence, PTSD. Back then, in 2006, people thought, oh, crazy ass Jim, talking about doing a garden for, the shelter. They didn't quite get it then. You can go to school now and get a degree in therapeutic horticulture. So gardening isn't just about growing a food that's delicious to eat. Yes, it's about that, but it's about more than that. This is an image of one-parent scholar house. This is young single moms going to post-secondary, provides a residential area. They have a preschool and a nursery for the kids. This young woman here, we were out one night in the summer. It was really hot. We were working at night under the full moon and under the stars. This young woman began to cry because she had never before worked in the garden under the moon and the stars. This is an image. My son out here, got two sons here, Obior and Ajani. And then Obior and I used to work a lot in Lexington together, doing a variety of things, and one of them was at the Christmas house. This is a program for women who are court-ordered, healing from drug and alcohol addiction. This sister here, Belinda, would come to the garden every Tuesday. It was a 2-year court-ordered stay at the Christmas house. The second year you finish up, you go down to the courthouse, and you graduate. Ask our son Obior, don't believe me. When we were there, she was all dressed up because she was graduating, and she began to cry. I said, this garden saved my life. If it hadn't been for Obior and his crazy dad, I would be back in jail. I helped co-write this book here, Sustainable World Source Book. It's available, written in 2008. You can buy it online still, for about $3. The picture next to that is a picture in Detroit, a young woman from Yemen who had a hard time adjusting when she was brought to the country with her family as war refugees. Her name is Selena. She wouldn't talk. We had a garden that we were working in, and 2 or 3 months went by, and she didn't want to speak and whatever. She would interact. Then one day, we were growing radishes. You know how fast they grow. One day she was in the garden. She pulled out of the ground a radish, and she said, "Look, Mr. Embry, it's a radish." I said, she spoke. That photo hangs in a St. Joe Hospital in Lexington, and it's called gold dust, which reminds us that on her hands, the black soil is more valuable than gold. Systems thinking. This is a picture of a young woman named Amanda, who's about 5 years old. She was homeschooled. This is one of our gardens there in Lexington. And we did all kind of art in our gardens, okay? In our gardens, you couldn't say no to the kids, okay? I told adults, come and help, you can't say no. We did all kinds of art to help kids come in and be creative and be playful. We used to find these ceiling fans that were thrown out. We'd bring them in, have the kids paint them, put them on a 2x4, they could still spin. This young girl here came in and helped us finish painting it. Said, Mr. Embry, we're missing something. I said, what are we missing? She said, there's no bee on the flower. I said, you're right. So she went around that garden lot. She found a plastic bottle. She had her own little toolkit, and she drilled some holes through a walnut. She found some of these garden planter plastic, sleeves, painted it up, and put it on there. That's systems thinking. There's no better place to begin teaching systems thinking than in a garden. Again, my son and I used to organize for about 6 or 8 years this Bluegrass Local Food Summit. It was 4 days. We had 1 day oftentimes for government people. Out of that series of events, the government hired a full-time local foods coordinator. And back then, 2008 up through 2012, most local governments had nothing about food in their governmental structure. But now they all do. We also had tracks for hospitals and getting better food in the hospitals, as well as farmers markets that you have now around the campuses. But we also had a Saturday was different tracks, let's say young people. We had all kinds of hands-on workshops for kids, all day Saturday. How to do composting, how to make rain barrels, and things like that. We got to have, in terms of vision for the future, we got to have food summits where we engage hundreds of kids as part of the dynamic of the summit. The Saturday was also a time where we would have teachers come in, provide workshops for school gardens, pollinator gardens, and things like that. And we also had, and Obiora can attest to this, we had all these wonderful resources on our website before the summit would occur. We spent about 10 years working with Will Allen and Growing Power. They're out of Milwaukee. They shut down a couple years ago. But we would have every year this growing food injustice gathering 1 year. The next year would be a much larger format of a Growing Power Small Farm Conference. At the gathering, which was a smaller event, we would choose a theme. It might be sacred soil, sacred water, sacred fire. And what we would do, if it was sacred soil, we would ask each person, when you come, go to the ground, take a tablespoon of the soil in your garden, in your farm, in your yard, whatever, and put it into a little vial, and then bring it to the gathering. And when we begin, we will all put our soil in the big cauldron to bring the soil with us. Or it might be sacred water. And we would say, wherever your water comes from that you're drinking and using, get some water and bring it with you. That represents who you are and pour it into the cauldron. I'm saying that rituals like that, they're important. Most of our gatherings, we call them a conference, are based upon an academic model. You bring in professors, they've written a book or an article, and they come in and want to talk about how great they are and what they've written. Not about solutions. So we have to, in terms of our vision, change how we structure a food summit. I have, out of practice and out of habit, when I come to a conference and I take my name badge, I draw on it my bioregion, my trees, the mountains, the flowers. That's what has made me, not the city with big buildings and pavement, but the water, the soil, the trees is truly who I am. So we ought to have, again, I think, at food summits, conferences, a time when you get your name badge, have a whole table of, colored markers and draw where you're from as a ritual, as a reminder. We would also do murals. We would hold the gathering at a fairgrounds with housing, and we were there 24/7 for 3 days, going to the Native American mounds. We would have a sacred fire that burned 24/7. We were around the fire, and we would do murals. We would do things that was being creative. Now, back in 2020, I was invited by, I call him Brother Gore, to be a part of the Climate Underground. We were all probably focused on Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, and COP27. We have some serious challenges around climate change. I was reading on the way here from Kentucky that up in Alaska, 5 indigenous nations have each gotten about $30 million from the government to move them out of the flooding areas in Alaska. Is one example of what's occurring around the world. I've been a part of Slow Food since 2008 as an organization, but I always say that slow food is a practice that we've been doing, our grandparents, great-grandparents were doing their whole lives, eating locally, growing food largely organically, sharing in their community. I just came back from Italy for the big Terra Madre gathering. Here are some of the aspects of slow food. In terms of a vision, everyone here ought to be aware of, connected with in some fashion, this global slow food movement. In my view, I've been around for a long time. This global movement has the potential to be the most transformative, revolutionary movement that's here now, in my view. So I encourage you to join the Terra Madre movement, means Mother Earth. Now, this is an image here of two guys. Carlo Petrini was the slow food founder back in the mid-'80s. This year, like Jeff Poppin here, Carlo decided to retire. He's about my age. And we elected a new international president. This young brother here, Eddie McKeeby, he's about 36 years old. He's a farmer from Uganda. This is a message that says, for the future. The vision for the future is that the future belongs in the hands of young people. It says that. It says also the future lies more in the global south than the global north. It says also that Africa will play a significant role. As I'm closing out here, this summer, to get a better sense of what's going on around the country, I embarked on what I call my joy and justice journey in June. I was gone 35 days, drove 6,000 miles, 15 states, 30 farms and gardens, 12 slow food chapters, 10 food co-ops, 9 federal state parks. I was in Hawaii on the big island that's over there now. I was around the crater of the volcano that's erupting now. I visited 6 Native American tribes and organizations, 3 universities, and I gave out 500 packets of our new Ujamaa seed collection. Here's, according to my Google Maps, my journey from Kentucky. Now, I'm going to be repeating this journey this coming year. It won't be the exact same stops. If y'all want to go with me, for part of the journey. You say, well, Jim, like when you go to Grand Canyon, I want to join you there and then go visit in Santa Fe the Native American Indian School. I said, fine. Join me on that leg. Or if you want to go, as I did this summer, to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and visit George Ford Square, I said, well, fine, I'm going to go there again. Join me at George Ford Square. I had a wonderful time. I'm working on different videos and documentaries of pieces of that trip. Joy and Justice Journey in June. About a year ago, we formed Ujamaa Seeds as a response to COVID. I don't know how it was with you all, but for those couple of years, you couldn't find seeds. They were all sold out. So we're saying now, everyone has to be a seed farmer. If we want to ensure resilience locally, we all got to find ways to become seed farmers in this area of Middle Tennessee. That's part of the vision. Become seed farmers. We have in our collection about 200 different seeds. We have about 30 different kinds of collard greens, 120 different kinds of okra, and our seeds are specialized in what's called the African diaspora, indigenous diaspora, and so forth. Here's some of our members here. Ira Wallace was mentioned, can't be today. She's like our mother. She helped give us birth because of all of her many years of work with Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. We love her so dearly. You can join our efforts here in the Tennessee or Chattanooga area, become part of our network of seed farming. Again, this is the catalog out front on my table, or some of the Southern Exposure seed catalogs. This idea of indigenize. This is a map here. The one before was a map of the indigenous tribes pre-colonial. There were some 500 plus tribes, many of us already know. Here are the ones based upon certain websites, the folk that live here in the Tennessee area. So part of our work is to become familiar with these nations who were here in Turtle Island for 10, 20, 30,000 years. They just might know something. They just might know something. This is an image here. You probably don't know this guy here. It's John Muir, the founder of Sierra Club. He went out west, as you know, and helped create these different national parks. But did you know that John Muir came right near Nashville on his 1,000-mile trek to the Gulf? Came right near here in 1867. But of course, that was about 30 years after the Trail of Tears, when most all Native people were removed out of Tennessee, Kentucky. Here's a map of the Trail of Tears. Now, when John Muir came to Tennessee, he wrote about it in his journal. And he wrote about the magnificent, the huge trees in the forest of Tennessee, Kentucky. Here's how they looked in 1867. The point is, the reason why they were there is because Native people were the caretakers. The trees were part of their family. And John Muir called these areas wilderness, the wild areas. The folk who lived here called them home, not something wild. Again, the idea of changing the story, changing the narrative. But now here are charts of how the U.S. Turtle Island looked in 1620 with the forest cover. 1620, 1850, 1926, 1990. Talk about genocide of trees. Can you imagine the trees taking a knee and saying, we can't breathe? The trees said that. The buffalo said that. The beavers said that. Native people said that. I can't breathe wasn't just a pronouncement by George Floyd. So, part of the vision, my point is, part of the vision for local food, sustainable food, has to also be reforesting the country. You wonder why there's all these floods and storms and things like that. Because there's no protection on the land, no mangrove swamps, trees. So I'm saying that part of the vision, Local Food Summit, needs to be how do we get more trees planted? We have an example in Kenya with Wangari Maathai, with the Green Belt movement connecting reforestation and the oppression of women. If you haven't read her work, Green Belt movement, Wangari Maathai, talking about reforesting these areas and how it relates to the oppression of women. There is occurring around the world a global movement around what's called rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth. There are countries like Ecuador, I have a friend here from Ecuador, Bolivia, who are putting in their constitution the jurisprudence of rights of nature, rights of the mountains, rights of the water, rights of the trees. So, part of the vision, again, Local Food Summit, you ought to have within your bylaws, Natalie, whoever else, something about the rights of nature. You ought to have this university write into its university mission, rights of nature. City government. This is, again, a growing movement, rights of nature on Mother Earth, which corresponds to this concept called seed rematriation, which means the seeds that grew here in Tennessee grew because they were part of the family of this area. And now the seeds, many of them are in the Smithsonian. They're at the university museums. So part of the effort of indigenous people is to rematriate seeds. We can all help with that in a variety of ways. We have folk here who are part of the Tennessee Native American Indian Association. They're here, they have a table outside. Some of the books I recommend, many of you all may already have them, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmer. Healing Grounds by my friend Liz Carlisle. Montana passed 20 years ago a state law that requires K through 12 that every child has to have in its curriculum, K through 12, Indian education for all, they call it. We should have that in Tennessee, in Kentucky, where we all are grounded in this culture, this legacy, these teachings. I put up here purposely on the table like an altar. Up here are various things. Up here is some corn. Where did corn come from? The folks in the Americas. 5,000 years ago, took this plant, teosinte, and we offer it in our collection as a reminder of the wonderful gifts of indigenous people to food and agriculture. They spent 5,000 years working with this wild grass to make it into this beautiful array. Again, I mentioned that these folk might know something. Three sisters, we talk about farming organically, regenerative, permaculture. These folk were doing this for the last 10,000 years here in Turtle Island. This is just one representation. Three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So we could all have in our various community projects these kinds of representations. Now, what river flows near here? The Cumberland River. Anybody know where it begins? Where does the Cumberland River begin? This idea again of vision and systems thinking. This is a map of the USA water systems that we should all have part of our systems thinking. Because again, the Colorado River is drying up, Mississippi. We should all be concerned about water. The Cumberland River begins about an hour from my house in Kentucky, up in the mountain areas. Has 4 or 5 forks is where it begins. Then it flows down through Kentucky. You can see it here. Sweeps down into the Tennessee, and then it goes north back to Kentucky and empties out. That river was called by the Shawnee Wasioto. The French called it the Shawnee River before it became the Cumberland River. I've been trying to give some snippets of what I've been up to for the last 60 years, trying to give some idea of what the sense of vision looks like and what might be helpful along the way. How do we begin to think in terms of systems thinking, holistic thinking, so we can be about the business even more so of transforming the food and ag system here in Middle Tennessee, here in this bioregion. As was mentioned, I was in Brazil years ago, in 2004, when the president now, Lula, became president back then in 2004. And I visited what's called the Movimento Sem Terra, landless workers. I also had the chance to meet Arundhati Roy at that World Social Forum. And I love this quote of hers, because we're about the business of transforming the food and ag system, about a paradigm shift. And she says, yes, another world is not only possible, she is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Let's take that as our charge, individually, collectively. Another world is possible, and she's on her way. Thank you.